everybody, and welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I'm Taylor Rockwell. Daryl Grove will be back tomorrow. For now, I'm going to be talking to Charles Boehm. Charles has written about soccer for pretty much every place that pays people to write about soccer, and he's with me today to talk about Berhalter's latest roster. We go deep on DC United's past, a little bit about their present, and more about their future. Charles has obviously covered DC United for a good long while, so he's got a lot of expertise there. We get into the financial state of the league, and a whole lot more. If you don't know Charles, I promise you he's terrific. And if you do know Charles, then you already know he's terrific, so there's not much else for me to say, aside from over to me talking to Charles Boehm. With me now on the line, making his Total Soccer Show debut, I believe, is a freelance writer, editor based in D.C. His work has appeared on the High Press Soccer, MLS Soccer, USSoccerPlayers.com, Pro Soccer USA, many sites. It's Mr. Charles Boehm. Charles, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It is a pleasure to be here, Taylor. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think I've been on before, but it might well have been like half a decade ago because That's how long we've all been doing this damn thing.
Wow. So would that have been with Daryl or with a group of people?
I feel like I phoned in to both of you guys.
Oh, wow. All right.
To talk to both you guys. But it could, honestly, like it's we're talking about sands of time, vague, misty recollections. I could be wrong. So I think do you guys have friends of the pod? I feel like I deserve friends of the pod test at least.
I mean, I think
we come out to your shows and stuff when I can.
I mean, well, let's go there for a moment because that is definitely true. We did the live show at Audi Field. Charles was just there. Charles was just there, hanging out, supporting the team. And then I don't know if you would love this on record, but I'm going to go ahead and put it on record. Charles is also the one who, like, when we were at All Star, was like, "So are we going out, guys, or what's going on here?" Like, Charles keeps that night going in a very, very positive way, and for that, I'm very thankful. So thank you for that, Charles.
Networking activities are very important in this industry.
There it is. You see, you're actually, like, that's totally true, and not something like a little view behind the curtain for people. Is that, like, Daryl and I never knew that, like, until we went to the convention in Philly, the coaches convention in Philly, when they were doing the elections and the candidates were doing their speeches. We never did any events, and it is totally true that going to events, you meet the people that you read day in and day out, and you meet people that are, like, involved in the soccer community, and it really does help. So yeah, if you can go and have drinks with Charles, I strongly suggest you do so. I guess you can't do that very well, but other people should have drinks with Charles, and Charles is right that networking is very important. But I wanted to talk to Charles about a variety of topics today. If you're a stick-to-sports person, we may cover some ground that you don't love, but I'm fine with that. And I'm going to start with something that people may not love, may find particularly divisive. Charles, you have Giassi Zardes in your starting 11 for the USA-Mexico game, and I'd like you to defend yourself.
Hey. Now, the tweet was very clear, Taylor. I worded it very clearly and carefully in order to head off this type of bogus questioning.
I know.
I will not have this. I will not allow you to take the conversation down this cul-de-sac.
For what it's worth, Daryl and I also had Giassi Zardes in the starting 11 against Mexico. But I did want to ask you more generally about, like, things you're most excited to see from this roster in these upcoming friendlies.
No, but I'll tell you what. I know you've broached this subject in jest, but this is a great topic that I want to get this out there. Because again, I have these moments. I turned 40 not too long ago, and I realized I've been writing about the game a long time, and I've been watching and, like, sort of living in American soccer culture for even longer. And I want to tell all the young people, because the sport is, the demographics of the sport tend to trend so young and there's so many new fans all the time. Collective memory is sometimes an issue. As I've been following the United States men's national team since approximately the '94 World Cup, possibly before that. I feel like I attended my first game in 1993 at the Cotton Bowl in Dallas. So I think I think I could be misremembering. But anyway, I've been following this program for way too long, and there's always at least 90+% of the time of that quarter century plus, there's always been a player or a couple players for every coach that a significant segment of fans dread, hate, despise, are baffled by their inclusion, just have whatever negative feelings or questioning feelings towards the continued selection of a certain player or set players. There's always that person or people, because national team coaches have so many variables they have to deal with. At least this is my best theory as to why this is. National team players are like you can only change so much. And if you do, you get into a whole new set of other problems. But they have so many, the coaches have so many variables that they like known quantities. Even if a player is not spectacular or is not elite level at what they do, if they can do it at a consistent level and bring a certain skill set or output or sort of mentality or contribution in training, those guys tend to stay on the roster. They stay in the roster projections and pictures and calculations, and so then they get called in a lot. And that's the case for Gyasi Zardes. It was Alexi Lawless. I have to say, no disrespect, Alexi, but to the end of his national team career, he was a trusted veteran, and a lot of fans thought it was time for him to go. And he stuck around because he was good at certain things, and he brought certain things to the table. Frankie Haydick was another one. Jess Agus was another one.
Yep.
In more recent times, we had players. People can probably think of Bob Bradley type players like that, and I think that's important to remember when you're groaning about feeling that Gyasi Zardes is not national team level, but seeing him in roster after roster and seeing him as, I think he has the second most caps or third most, somewhere in there, of the group that's been called this week. And it's not pure nepotism or favoritism or anything like that. There's reasons for that, and there's a history of that.
You're totally right. And it's a thing that like I've thought about in like pieces, but never put together to realize that it is a kind of consistent thing regardless of the manager. Because even with Klinsmann, I remember being frustrated about like, why are we still calling in Orozco? I don't understand why this keeps happening. He seems like he's proved that he can't do it, and yet he continues to be called in. And you're absolutely right that it's easy to forget that when the new manager comes to town. It does feel like Michael Bradley has transcended a series of managers in being that player for a lot of people. And I'm not entirely sure why that's the case, but I think you're dead on with Gyasi Zardes, and to some extent maybe Omar Gonzalez, although he's not in this roster. So does that mean then that like do you try to see what it is that Greg Berhalter sees in Gyasi Zardes? Is that a part of watching him when he plays for you, or is it just sort of a recognition that that's probably who he is and that's probably why he's here?
No, absolutely. I think you have to. I try to take that lens to approach games with that lens, because we all have most of us at least have our opinions about the game and what we'd like to see or what we wish was happening or what we would do if we were the coach. But at the end of the day, Greg Berhalter's the coach, or whoever's the coach at a given time for any team that I'm watching. There's limits to it, but it's good to try and put yourself in that coach's head as much as possible, and then things make a little more sense, I think, even if it's not the way you would do it.
And the lineup I was referring to, where you kind of gave your rough idea for starting 11, like that was, I think that was just sort of like what you expected to see based on past performance. I don't want to mischaracterize, but I am wondering if that lineup has changed at all in the last 24 hours, or is it more or less the same?
Good question. Let me scroll back to it. So I think it was a very early stab based on what we know coming into this camp. But there is always camp is camp. Like, these guys are going to get some time together. They're going to be they're arriving at camp with certain levels of form and mentality, and there's so much human element in here. And players do have the opportunity to turn a coach's head and impress in training. Or there's just so many calculations to it. So yes, I think if I can make sure I'm referring to the 11 that I laid out, I'm expecting there will be changes to that group because there's players that are going to come in form. There's players that are going to be. So here's what I had. I had Stefan, Ream, Brooks, Long, Cannon, Trapp, McKennie, Boyd, Pulisic, Morris, Zardes. So that was coming in with the recollection of where Pulisic played in kind of a central playmaking role in the last camp, if I'm remembering. And again, I don't have the data in front of me on the previous window, but it sounds as though people have sort of surmised from the list of players putting Christian Pulisic in as a forward. There's this sort of conventional wisdom forming that means he's going to be in a wide attacking role in this window. Maybe not. I mean, Greg Berhalter actually kind of laughed at another reporter's phrasing of the number 10 experiment in the conference call yesterday. He said he doesn't care about it. Was that the question you asked? Or not? I guess you asked a question about McKennie, but somebody else, Tom Bogert, asked about Pulisic, and you can tell that Berhalter he's a methodical guy, so he's probably got a couple of different scenarios in his head that he's already plotting out for how he sees training and games and whatnot going, and he'll react dynamically in the moment. Morris is to me is not a locked-on starter by any means. He's coming in a decent run of form, and he's shown an ability to kind of do a job in that wide role in a band of three in a 4-2-3-1. But there's plenty of players on this list that could move ahead of him, I think. Same thing goes for Will Trapp. That's another player that polarizes opinion right now. He's sort of the next Michael Bradley, I guess. Very advanced skill set in certain facets of a number six's job, and in other areas he has real questions that have dogged him at international level. So maybe maybe we'll see someone else try it out there. So it's that's the fun part of it. Fans shouldn't assume that this coach is set in his ways, because I think he is a data-oriented and sort of intellectually curious coach by nature.
And then how much turnover do you think there will be between one game and the next? With Major League Soccer continuing on, there's the playoffs coming up, so teams are going to be worried about that. Do you think we will see at least a couple players after the Mexico game maybe go back to their clubs? And not necessarily new players come in, but more so just kind of players return so that their MLS teams aren't too frustrated.
Yeah, I mean, with the 26 is a big group, right, for a relatively tight window. So I think there's a reason for that. And fans have to remember that you're not necessarily going to get that information ahead of time as we're in the phase we're in right now, evaluating the roster. I would think so. That would make a lot of sense because you've already seen this sort of ripple of whether it's valid complaints or whataboutism, sort of about players that get called and players that don't, and where their teams are in the MLS table, for example, and that sort of thing. So, and there's always a very delicate and I think calculated process with players overseas too. These are not competitive games. I would think that Berhalter is happily making some concessions in this window because he knows he's got competitive matches in the next two windows. So those are the ones where you really, even though they're against, generally sort of a notch or two down in terms of the level of the opposition, that the games count. They go into FIFA rankings, the CONCACAF Nations League. So I think we'll see a little bit of flux there.
And for you personally, like, how do you watch these types of friendlies against stronger opposition? Do you care about the result, or is it much more like, okay, who's playing that number 10 spot, or what's this guy doing? Is it more sort of like little experiments on the field that catch your attention, or are you watching the game just kind of as a whole, wanting to see the result?
Probably all the above. I mean, games like this can go a long way if you can get a result. If you can, obviously nobody wants to lose to a rival like Mexico. The fact that these games are at home counts for something. There should be some motivation there. I mean, results are always part of the process, but I think the key here is that you have quality opposition that's going to test you, that's going to puncture some of your assumptions, probably force players to adapt, force players to lift their game, against probably higher level of opposition overall. I think these teams are both better than the United States, at least on paper. So there should be some sense of competitiveness, of a plan being in place and a plan being executed, right? I mean, that's, again, we talked about variables earlier. To me, that's the start. We hear all about Berhalter's philosophies and his concepts and this advanced curriculum that he's implementing over a long term and all that sort of thing. Well, okay, so this is you're almost a year in now. These are games that don't count, but they are big showcases and against good opposition.
More still to come from my conversation with Charles Boehm, but first I wanted to let our listeners know that today's show is brought to you in part by our friends over at Fubo TV. Fubo is the only soccer-focused TV streaming service. They've got so many games for you to watch. I have really loved having Fubo, especially for the weekend reviews, because you can kind of flip around really easily. All the soccer channels are right there, or at least most of the soccer channels are right there, and you're able to basically watch them, and then when they get bored, you can just move on to the next one. But the key feature for us has been that you can DVR. They've got the cloud DVR, which is incredibly useful, up to 500 hours of cloud storage. So if you're not going to be able to watch the games, or say that you might need to watch a couple of them Sunday night before you talk about them on Monday, you can record them and then they're right there, nice and easy, but you don't have to install a whole bunch of equipment or have people come out and run lines. Nope, just sign up and you're good to go. And if you forget to hit record and do not DVR something, then the good news there is that they've got 72-hour replays of all kinds of soccer content. So essentially, if something airs and it was on Fubo, you can can watch it for up to 3 days after it aired. And I'm assuming that will extend to the Cooligans. Our friends the Cooligans will be launching a Fubo show, I think sometime in the very near future, which we're very excited to watch and see how it goes. And if they have a live audience, be there and heckle them. That's my goal. So you'll be able to find that there as well. So you can go to FuboTV.com/TSS. One more time, that's FUBOTV.com/TSS. And you can get 10% off your first 2 months of Fubo. That again gives you 4K TV, 500 hours of cloud storage, 72-hour replays on all kinds of content, and a 10% discount by going to FuboTV.com/TSS. Thank you very much to Fubo for sponsoring today's episode. Now back to me talking to Charles. See, that's why I was excited to have Charles on the show. We need that veteran perspective, and it is a veteran perspective from, I think, 1993, you said was your first game. When did you first...
Something like that.
I see, that's good. And that was in Texas, though. When did you first start covering DC?
So I moved to DC in November 2003, and then I entered the job market a year or so later. Mm-hmm. And I was just, when you're applying for jobs, I'd done the Peace Corps, so I'd lived abroad, and I was relocated here, and I was trying to figure out where I was going to go and what I was going to do. And I was applying to a range of different sort of communication-oriented jobs. And I happened to apply for a job posting at old schoolers may remember that before ESPN FC, there was ESPN SoccerNet.
Yep.
With their soccer hub. And there was a posting on there, like an ad in one of the, sort of like page ads for that's hiring for or seeking sort of like, I think you're seeking journalists or writers in MLS markets, like for a beat writing position, basically. And so I applied for it, and I'll spare your listeners the whole story, but I just applied for it kind of on a lark at the same time I was trying to get a full-time job. And it just so happened that I got a full-time job at a communications and public relations firm on K Street in DC at the same time that I got called back for that gig. And it was a side gig kind of. And I would typically go and I was covering DC United for what was then MLSnet.com before what we now know as MLS Soccer. And I would go out to like DC United trainings on my lunch break once or twice a week, cover the games. It's a very different media landscape back then, I can assure you, but it was a side hustle and something enjoyable to do. And then eventually, 7 or 8 years later, it ended up being something I could shift towards full time.
And obviously that coverage includes going to RFK. Do you have any particular RFK-ish memories of RFK?
Oh, too many. Lots of good ones. There's so many. I mean, there's a book probably, but I try not to flog my work too much in these kind of appearances, but my friend Pablo Maurer and I did a really fun long form piece about RFK around the time of the last game there, the last call at RFK week at the end of the MLS season in 2017, and had a blast just talking to people that have worked there a long time and played there over the years. And there's so many, and I generally have positive feelings more so than negative ones. Maybe it was easier to work there than to pay money to go be a fan there. Mm-hmm. But probably the RFK story I end up telling the most is one of my favorites, of just to kind of set the vibe for people, is that the upper deck, right? Fans will remember, like, the upper deck is not used much for soccer. And it's sort of this big swooping, mm-hmm. High area that kind of looms above the pitch and everything. And it's rarely used since the NFL team left. And so occasionally there would be stories about things that would be found in the upper deck on a rare occasion when it would get used. And my favorite is occasionally, like, stadium staff will find dead fish amongst the seats of the upper deck, and it took sort of like a multi-level snooping process to figure out that what was happening was that RFK is right next to the Anacostia River.
There it is.
Natural areas there, and birds of prey are known to catch fish in the river nearby, and they carry them up there and either drop them or don't. Whatever happens, something gets interrupted. So these fish are getting dropped by large birds into the upper deck and found days, months, weeks later by stadium staff, and have to sort of solve that bizarre tableau.
I like that. I mean, between that and the family of raccoons, I like that RFK has become like a wildlife sanctuary of sorts. At least there's that. That's a nice step for them in the right direction, I guess.
It really is an urban wildlife habitat. And people say the family. I mean, there's probably multiple families. And I was out at DC training on Tuesday. They still train at the auxiliary fields adjacent to RFK, and the team's locker rooms are in RFK. Their day-to-day environment doesn't change until next year when the new training complex out in the burbs opens up. But we're all wondering, like, the next step probably is demolition. It's not imminent. It could be years to come. And the final plan for that site isn't known. But at some point, that building will either be gutted or imploded. And we're wondering what the wildlife exodus will be like. I mean, it could really destabilize the local neighborhood environment.
Yep, I imagine that will happen, but I also feel like that's a perfect metaphor for DC United as they currently exist, that they're like stuck between like RFK and the kind of like past and Audi Field and the present. Like for you, like, do you miss some of that RFK vibe? I know Bruce Arena, for example, came out. He was fairly critical of Audi Field, talked about the lack of connections to the teams of the past. They're working to deal with that now, from what I understand. But like, why do you think that maybe wasn't necessarily there to begin with? Because it feels like there sort of has been this transition from RFK and banners and Echeverry and Moreno and all that to a more, for lack of a better term, like kind of sterilized Audi Field, at least in its present incarnation.
Yeah, it's a period of transition, and it didn't. You'd like to think that we tend to think maybe that there's once the new stadium opens, sort of there's a bow on everything and everything moves on and it's a proud new era and you turn the page, and it's not, though. This Audi Field has been a really difficult, urban sports stadium project that's had incredible cost overruns and has had to is sort of still in development, right? They're still figuring out, they had to replace the pitch this year. They're still figuring out how that's going to work. There's going to be an XFL team in there next year. No one's sure how that cohabitation is going to go, right? There's still literally buildings being developed within the shadow of Audi Field. So that neighborhood is in flux. The team is in flux, and a club is also, more than anything, right, is the stories and the institutional memory of the people that work there and are around the community that you hopefully have developed around a club, right? And a lot of that has been disrupted or even stunted because they're losing money to RFK. Everyone knows that, and there's inevitably, it dragged on so long. There was a human cost to that ownership changed. And before the current, there was an ownership change, basically a management change recently. But before that, when Eric Tilhier took managing control of the club, they felt they had to slash costs as much as they could, and so the staff at DC United over the years, dating back a decade or so now, has been slashed to the bone repeatedly, and it affects all areas of the club, right? You can only do so much with so much human power and human capital, and inevitably, I think some of the institutional memory got lost. There were people that had been day one since 1995 employees who were lost or who were cut loose or let go over the past decade, and so that sense of tradition has definitely changed. Now the people in charge now they value it. They know that that's one of the most valuable commodities that club has, and that it matters. But it's just hard when you have a fan base, a generational shift in your fan base. You have turnover in your in your front office, and all those sorts of things inevitably affect how the club looks at the past and the future. So it's a tough spot. I have a lot of empathy for them. They take a lot of stick, and a lot of it is not. It's sins of omission rather than sins of kind of malevolence. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be done or that could be done better. But it does at least seem to be a commitment to improvement. The question for me always comes back to resources. They're making more money now, but they're also spending more money, and there appears to me to be a high amount of leverage in terms of the financial assets of DC United. So they can only open the wallet so fast and so quickly, and to such an extent. And that kind of is a TBA at the moment to see kind of how that all takes shape, especially after Wayne Rooney goes home in the winter.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because that's one of the things that I was most excited to discuss with you, because I say it on the show frequently, like a nominal DC fan, and I say that because I don't come up to every single game, and I certainly wasn't there in the stands when they were having the worst season ever. But I do have an interest. I do care about the team. It's the first American team that I cheered for in 1996. But it has felt since since like the days of RFK clearly not being good enough anymore, that the team were always sort of moving towards, okay, we're going to get a new stadium and then we're going to be a sort of, for lack of a better term, like modern Major League Soccer team. And now they have that. And then suddenly they go on that run last year, obviously with most of the games being at home. And it kind of felt like, oh, okay, like that moment has arrived. They've moved to that next level with Rooney and Acosta. And now there's this season and the downturn. And I find myself sort of uncertain of where they are as an organization, because it felt like Rooney's going to be there for a while. Acosta's going to be there for as long as they can hold on to him. They've got this core squad. Olsen's there, and it felt like it was moving in the right direction. And now this season, even though they're still in the playoffs, it feels like maybe that's not necessarily the case. And I can't tell if that's me trying to be objective and see things as they are, or my sort of fan bias leaning into the way I'm seeing things. So I guess I'm asking you to be the therapist for me, if you don't mind, Charles.
A good way of approaching, or I've found it useful to approach DC United's current situation. One, starting by looking at Wayne Rooney. Rooney has turned out to be kind of an old school DP, sort of a Beckham style DP, where he's helped them on the field immensely. He's helped them off the field. He's made them relevant in the market in a way that few other players could, and that there's not many people on earth that can do that by themselves single-handedly. So he's really patched up a lot of areas of need for the club, and it's so many things. It's his name, his reputation, his mentality, and even the contract. Right, like the contract has proved to be a win-win. I mean, they spent more on him and invested more in him than anyone else in history, in the club's history by a long ways. But the contract was very intelligently built to be very incentive heavy. So he's been, up until his Derby move at least, he's been really committed, really eager to be on the field, really motivated. And I'm not saying that that's strictly because of the financial incentives of the contract. And he's a pro in general. He's a gamer. He's a guy who wants to be involved and wants to do his best. But he also has an incentive to do that financially. And so that all worked out really well. And he single-handedly fixed so many areas, or at least remediated them. And when he goes away, there's not many players out there that can do all that like he did, especially not to the tune of what was, I think, a total financial commitment of something like between $13 and $15 million, if I remember correctly, over a period of 3.5 years. Like, I don't know who else can do that. I mean, you could say that Orlando has a type of player like that in Nani, but it's not really the same. I mean, most of the jerseys you see around Audi Field and DC United jerseys around town are Rooney jerseys, and there's a lot of Man U Rooney jerseys at Audi Field every week. So I think that the question is going to be, there will be some money from Rooney's unfulfilled deal that becomes available to the club this winter, but do you go out and try and find another whale like that, or do you spread that money around and try and do something more like maybe what Red Bulls or Philly or a team like that does with those resources?
And from what you understand, like, do you expect Rooney to speak positively of his time in DC and in Major League Soccer? Like, do you think he goes back to England as sort of an ambassador for the league and for the team? Or, like, I know there were some reports that maybe, like, Colleen Rooney, his wife, wasn't so happy living in DC. Do you think it's more of a, like, yeah, we were there and now we're happy to be back in England?
Yeah, that remains to be seen. And I do suspect he's expressed his frustration with the refereeing, with the travel aspects, with most recently the lack of a chartered flight by DC United back from Vancouver, which is the longest road trip of the year for many MLS teams, and one that ended up being a full day of travel for United coming home. But here's the thing: it's hard to tell where certain personal factors and sort of institutional or systemic factors begin, because Wayne Rooney and his wife are, if I remember, their childhood sweethearts. Mm-hmm. This is their first time living outside of not just England, but the northwest of England. Forgive me if I'm messing up details here, but
no, I think you're right.
So there's been a long-standing issue with English footballing exports, right? They don't often leave the country because they don't have to, and sometimes they don't settle, or their families don't settle. The club, I think, did everything they could to ease the transition to the United States. I mean, I think they certainly helped them find a house. I think the house is part of in Bethesda. They live in the Maryland suburbs. I think the house is included in the contract. He's got a handler, one of their top staffers, Roy Mileta, who who is sort of the Rooney handler who drives him everywhere and helps him with stuff. And I don't think that there's much that DC United could have done other than, just coming up against the hard limitations of their financial picture, right? Like DC United, as my understanding, is not chartering any flights this year. I think you're limited to 2 round trips, charters a year during league play, if I remember right. Again, forgive me if I'm missing up the details, but they're not doing that. They're not using the charter option at all because it's just United is at sort of their financial position. Bigger clubs, richer clubs like Atlanta and the LA teams can sign those checks without thinking twice about it, and DC has to think twice about it. That's just their financial reality, and they're certainly not alone. That's probably closer to the MLS norm than the rich teams. So I think Rooney will probably have some at least, at the very least, slide remarks about the quality of officiating and some of the organizational, disciplinary stuff on a league-wide basis. But I don't think he's had a bad experience in DC specifically.
Hey folks, Taylor jumping in one more time to let you know that today's show is also brought to you in part by our friends over at Policy Genius. September is National Life Insurance Awareness Month. Most people aren't even aware of that fact. I was not. Most people aren't even aware that they need life insurance at all. That's why 40% of Americans don't have it. Now, Charles and I have been talking about life in RFK Stadium. We talk about that on the show today. And if you've ever been to RFK or you went there during the DC United years, you'll know that there was always a chance that maybe there'd be some falling debris. Maybe there's like an underwater tunnel that's flooded. Lots of different obstacles. There could be, aerial predators is what we learned. There could also be some raccoons in there. You never know. So maybe you do need that life insurance. Maybe that's what RFK should have taught us, is that you should always have life insurance just in case Magneto comes in and destroys the stadium. You want to make sure you're covered. I'm assuming Policy Genius will have coverage for that because they make it really easy to shop for life insurance online. In minutes, you can compare quotes from top insurers to find your best price. Once you apply, the Policy Genius team will handle all the paperwork and the red tape, and they make it very easy. So you don't have to wait for, say, 20 years, the way DC United did to get their stadium. Policy Genius will have you waiting significantly less time than that. I shouldn't even compare them because, as I said before, in minutes, you can compare quotes from top insurers to find your best price. If you need life insurance, but you just haven't gotten around to it, National Life Insurance Awareness Month is as good a time as any to get started. So go to policygenius.com, get quotes, and apply in minutes. You can do the whole thing on your phone right now. Policy Genius is the easy way to compare and buy life insurance. Thank you very much to Policy Genius for sponsoring today's show. Now back one more time to me and Charles. I've got a couple of questions for you, but I know you've got a lot going on. Do you have time for a few more questions, or would it be better to wrap up now?
Sure, go ahead.
All right. Well, so you mentioned that there's a chance that they'll have some money to spend. They can spread it around a bit. If they do that with Rooney gone, do you think they trust Ben Olsen to oversee that project and to stick around next season? Is it wholly dependent on how this season plays out?
Yeah, a little bit of both. There's a lot of variables in this situation because you have Jason Levian, who is the managing partner, I believe is his title. He's been he was he was Sohir's right-hand man and brought in that ownership group and made that ownership change happen. He is the guy who's been the Mr. Fix-It, get stuff done, get the stadium done. He famously talked about, we see a path to a stadium and it's the jungle, but I have a machete or something like that, like talking about the challenges of DC United getting their own stadium. So Levian is the guy who gets the most responsibility and has the most credit for United getting to this point. And he has also presided over the recent shift of, or the recent addition of Steve Kaplan and his group, the Swansea Group, American-led group of investors. And Levian has because of his connections to both owners, the club's primary investors has the majority of the investors changed without Levian. Levian's he's still in the same position. So the question becomes, if change is seen, who decides that a change needs to be made? Is it Dave Casper, the general manager, parting ways with Ben Olsen, or is it Casper and Olsen being seen as in need of a package deal that will stay or go? And does Jason Levian make that decision, or does Steve Kaplan, who appears to be increasingly interested in taking a more active role, does he make decisions there, or does he kind of stay in a more background role? And then what happens? There's not a clear and obvious successor from within to me. Nolan Sheldon is one of his assistants who kind of runs training sessions, who was promoted from academy director a couple years ago. And he's, I think, one of the brightest young coaching minds in the league. But I suspect that they'd want to give him that he wouldn't necessarily be a permanent head coaching placement for Olsen. So then, do you stand up, do you wait the off season and maybe have a long process, or are they setting something up kind of secretly, coming up with a new technical staff? Like, there's a lot to kind of contemplate there. I think Olsen will get the rest of this year, but then with so much change being likely in the offing, with Luciano Acosta probably leaving, with Wayne Rooney leaving, that could make an owner decide that it's a logical time to change the staff too.
So this is also definitely my ignorance showing here, because like I assume that everyone in Major League Soccer that isn't like attending the games or writing about it is incredibly rich. And you said DC might be closer to maybe like the norm in terms of their spending habits. Why is that the case? Because like maybe in my mind it's just like the expansion fees are coloring the way I see things, but I just sort of assume that like the owners almost have like the unlimited faucet and they can turn it on or off if they choose to. And I've just kind of always operated the assumption that DC's ownership, for whatever reason, chose not to, similar to a few other organizations. And maybe that's just me, like, again, like having that sort of like, oh, they make a bunch of money, expansion fees. I know MLS loses a little bit, but I'm sure they've all got money to spend. So why is that the case? Do you think that like there is less money to go around than it might seem there should be?
Well, there's a pretty significant spectrum, a pretty broad spectrum of ownership, wealth, and commitment levels. And when I say commitment, that's talking about their financial commitment, their willingness to spend money or lose money on their team, whether that's simply because they don't care about profit and loss, or they're making an investment towards the future, or sitting on an investment, what have you. So there's a big range, and there's, I think right now, at least Houston is generally perceived to be probably at the maybe the far end in terms of modest spending, and then Atlanta and LAFC are kind of at the other extreme. What it comes down to is that they're all spending, they're all dumping money into a communal pot every year that gets distributed via the sort of socialist elements of single entity, right? Where they're all putting in money that they're all sharing via allocation money, targeted allocation money, general allocation money, all the different sort of league-oriented or league-centralized spending mechanisms. There's a little bit of collectivism, I think, on homegrown spending as well. There's a homegrown pot of money too, and then they're sort of painstakingly over the years, we've had these additional spending options carved out or in addition. So anytime a team is getting a designated player, if they're spending on that player, there's certain. I don't want to get into lost in the weeds here, but typically, like a player like Carlos Vela, the league is only fronting a very modest amount. The vast majority of that big contract is being paid directly from the club, the ownership of the club, or the managing organization of the club itself to the player. And of course, maybe it legally goes through MLS's coffers at some point. I honestly don't know what the bank transfers look like, but they're choosing to spend money that other teams don't have to spend. Right. So DC United in the skint years at RFK were always minimizing to the greatest extent the amount of ownership spending. They were using league money. They got very good at picking up, cast-offs via trades and waivers and that sort of thing. And then also even like a signing, a transfer acquisition, like for example, Ola Kamara, who they brought back to MLS from China in the recent weeks. If I remember correctly now, his salary and transfer fee that was paid to his Chinese club was via TAM. So when you see an allocation money designation, that means they're spending that collective money. Now, if you see, what they're spending on Wayne Rooney, the vast majority was optional spending. So they deserve, you have to say, okay, that's a level of commitment. Mm-hmm. So it's not that you have to spend that money to be competitive, but that usually gives you a little bit of a hint as to their commitment levels, the ownership's mentality, right? So everybody wants to maximize that collective pool of money because that's where you're sort of spending other people's money in a sense. But then if you really need to write a check, and charters are a good example, like if you want to max out the charter allocation that you're limited to by the league and all those rules, you're writing that check out of your own pocket. Or in the case of, for example, like the Patriots plane, it gets loaned to the Revolution once or twice a year for their charters. So it's all a question of kind of like what your resources are, both within the league and then within your individual ownership group, and how you marshal those. There's some teams that are kind of seem to have unlimited budgets in terms of that optional spending, that selective spending, and there's others that are very, very restricted in that regard.
That was very, very useful, and you did not get too into the weeds at all. Thank you for that. My last question, or my last kind of series of questions I wanted to ask about, relates to the piece you wrote for High Press Soccer. Back in May, it was titled MLS and the LGBTQ Community Stuck in the Muddled Middle. And it kind of went through some of the positives that Major League Soccer has done, some of the things that still need to be done, and some of the areas of concern. Obviously, that was written back in May. I'm wondering, with that in mind, like how you feel about the current state, where basically I think at the time you were arguing, not even arguing, you were just kind of stating that like it used to be sort of easier for Major League Soccer to stay in the middle and not really take a position. Maybe this was Kim McCauley's point in the article, and that like now as things have gotten more divisive, it becomes an almost untenable position. It feels like we're sort of even at a more intense point now than we were back then. So I'm wondering, like, is there a thing that you would like to see Major League Soccer do? Is there a thing you think they will do in order to kind of deal with things as they are, or will they just hope that it all blows over?
Yeah, I think we see that MLS has found itself in a minefield, not unlike what the NFL is dealing with Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling at the end in the national anthems, and what the NBA has encountered with, for example, like protests against police violence against the African American community. There's our politics and our cultural milieu or culture wars, however you want to look at it, are increasingly bleeding beyond boundaries that we once considered pretty hard firewalls, right? In terms of like stick to sports, right? Sports is an escape. We set aside our political or ideological discussions and conflicts in certain sort of safe spaces in other sectors of society, and that's harder than ever. It's messier than ever. There's no kind of the firewalls of old, I think, are changing or eroding. So in that regard, I don't view MLS situation as particularly unique. Everybody's trying to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. There's a constant, conversation, dialogue, actions, reactions, mistakes, corrections on those mistakes, right? So, and again, as I said in the piece, I want to recognize, and I think MLS does deserve recognition for being, what I would phrase, in my opinion, as more progressive on the spectrum of professional sports leagues in the United States and sports institutions. MLS is really well ahead of many of its peers in terms of how it approaches these issues. But inevitably, I think we hit the fundamental awkwardness of a corporate series or a set of corporate entities that have profit as the motive and that have typically have more conservative, more likely older and whiter executives and management and ownership positions in a league in which significant demographic, a bigger chunk of the fan base than any other league in North America, is left of center, progressive, has a significantly different approach to ideological questions. And so this kind of, we've got a perfect storm brewing with all these factors that I've reeled off, and there's no perfect roadmap that tells them what to do. And I think we're seeing them kind of stagger a bit from one set of blowback to another because they're trying to make everyone happy. And that's harder than ever, possibly impossible in modern America and North America, considering that Canada is part of this as well.
So it's unfair of me to ask you to design a perfect system in which MLS operates flawlessly?
If I had those kind of answers, I wouldn't be giving them away for free on the podcast. I'd be charging somebody crazy consulting fees, right?
I mean, you could and probably should. So, like, the last question on that, though, like, do you think, is Major League Soccer, do you think, like, aware of that issue? As you said, like, older, whiter, slightly more conservative. Do you think that that's a thing that they are aware of and would seek to change? Or, like, given, like based on their past performance, do you think it's more likely that they kind of like try to stay the course and kind of like keep things as they are for as long as they can? I guess what I'm asking is, in your opinion, in your experience, is Major League Soccer an entity that is like proven to change or seeks to change, or do you think it holds on a little bit to the kind of operational policies of the past?
I think that the league, they definitely are. This is an information-hungry executive leadership group. I mean, they spend a lot of time focus grouping fans and prospective fans in different segments of their present and desired future fan base. They want to know as much as they can. They want to know what fans think and feel and care about. The question just is, then how do you, once you decide, even if you get to the point where you decide that a change is necessary, you're turning a tanker ship here. There's a process that goes into discussing and then reaching consensus. At the end of the day, big decisions are made by a board of governors that have whatever 27 and growing ownership groups at a table, literally a big old conference table in a hotel ballroom, discussing behind closed doors the way forward for this league in every different sector. And they have management committees and focus committees and that sort of thing. They're trying to marshal their resources to take the best course forward. But that's a process, and you can imagine when you look at the spectrum of we talked about the spectrum of ownership wealth and investment levels, and then you have different ages, different mindsets, different regions, different countries. Even now, the MLS ownership is bigger, more diverse, and messier than ever. So I can only imagine. That's why Don Garber is paid well and has been very successful, is because he's good and he's trusted by these owners for his ability to sort of get consensus, take the temperature, and move forward in a way that benefits the majority of the group.
And as they move forward, I take solace in the fact that Charles will be there to cover it all and help me understand how to feel, because genuinely, like I like my takeaway from this entire conversation is summarized as like everyone is trying to do the best they can as much as they can. It's sort of like Jesse Zardes isn't trying to ruin your U.S. national team fandom. He's having the career he's having. And Don Garber isn't necessarily this like evil entity. Everyone's trying to do their best. So Charles, I appreciate the sort of nuanced and calm approach to soccer coverage that you bring to the table.
It's just one voice among many, and again, I should here probably acknowledge too. Look, I'm a freelancer and an independent contractor, but one of my biggest clients is the league website. And that's been the case. I've contributed in some form or fashion to the league website dating back to 2004. So for some that probably compromises my perspective on things. But I'm not an employee of the league. It's a client relationship that I have. And again, I recognize that maybe that colors my outlook on things, but I've been around a long time and I've seen a lot of these things develop and take shape. And it's, I feel like it's my job to try and find the most truth and the best balance in all of this going forward. And that's always my outlook on it. And people can take it, leave it, or incorporate it into their own individual perspective.
I mean, we often, anytime we say anything positive about the league, we tend to get at least a tweet or two accusing us of being paid shills by Don Garber and Soccer United Marketing. I mean, at least you're actually being paid by Major League Soccer. At least there's that.
Well, this is an old joke that those of us if you spend any time in the industry at all, you will have that accusation leveled against you. And it certainly doesn't stop people within the league from calling, or within American soccer in general, from calling me up and or emailing me and telling me that I hate MLS, or I have an axe to grind, or I'm compromised in the other direction and I'm too hard on them, or unfair, or too idealistic, or too cynical, or any number of other things. So yeah, if you do it for any length of time, you may see a few slings and arrows from a few different directions, and that's part of the process as well, and part of the joy of our modern media landscape.
Yeah, I also think that like if you're a solid journalist, isn't the goal to have both sides not necessarily hate you, but not necessarily love you?
like I saw a coach recently say on Twitter somewhere, the two most important words that I or like coaches in many situations can say are, "It depends." So it depends, Taylor.
I like that. I thought it was going to be no comment. It depends is a better one. But Charles, thank you so much for taking the time. Listeners, I think when we began this, Charlie had like maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and I have greatly exceeded that. So Charles, thank you.
Happy to help out. Always a pleasure to chat.
You gotta slice it.